Okay, well, it's 3 o'clock here on the East Coast, so let's get started. Thank you for everyone joining us today. My name is Juan Vasquez. I'm the Customer Support Manager for Novo Software. And today's webinar is going to focus on performing compensation in FCS Express 7. I'm sure a lot of you have different questions about compensation in general or compensation specifically in FCS Express. I am joined on the line today by my colleague, Kaya Ghosh. So if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll try to answer them as we go along or at the end of the webinar. Okay? So regarding today's webinar, we are going to focus on compensation specifically. If you were hoping to look at some of the basic features in FCS Express, like inserting plots, creating gates, things like of that nature to help you get started, this webinar is not going to be focused on that. We do have other webinars that focus on all the introductory features of how to get started in FCS Express. So please feel free to visit our videos page on denovosoftware.com, and you can watch those videos at your leisure. Okay. Today, we're going to focus on compensation. We're going to talk about all the different features that are integrated into FCS Express about compensation, as well as some of the new enhancements and features that we've added for FCS Express 7. And there are a couple of bullet points that we're going to touch upon today with regards to compensation in FCS Express. Okay, so the first thing we're going to touch upon as we go along are the FCS Express user options. So in your FCS Express user options, there is a preference specifically called default compensation to use. And that's basically going to govern how FCS Express behaves with compensation and your data. Okay, so the default value is to read automatically from the data file if you perform compensation in acquisition, and FCS Express automatically by default should read that matrix in as soon as you load that data file into FCS Express. Okay, what we'll also talk about is how FCS Express applies that compensation, what we need to do if we want to tweak it. Okay, and then what we'll also do is we'll introduce the concept of the compensations window. The compensations window is where we can see all the automatically applied matrices or any of the manually created matrices that we want to create for our data. And also, as we go along in the webinar, we'll eventually talk about mixed media compensation and how we could use data-specific gates to do that. And we'll also touch upon some of our new features, specifically the updated workflow that we have for the manual compensation matrix set that we have, as well as our new end-by-end compensated plots. Okay, so let's get started. So touching upon the FCS Express user options. As you all know, you can access your FCS Express user option in one of two ways. From File Options, or if you just click on your login down at the bottom of the screen, you can click on Options to open up your user-specific preferences. Okay, and these preferences are going to basically dictate your overall experience in FCS Express, the overall behavior, how FCS Express will treat your data. And one of these preferences is specifically the compensation to use by default. Okay, and the way it's used here is actually it's selected through a drop-down menu. And there are a number of options here available for your use depending on how you want to use compensation. Now, what we do is we actually give you a number of different options because no two labs are going to perform compensation in a similar fashion. No one's going to have the same panels or the same parameters, the same instrument to perform and collect their data. So what we try to do in our software is try to be as versatile and flexible as possible to help you create a sufficient workflow to get you through your work as quickly as you need to. Okay, and these preferences reflect that. So by default, FCS and then compensation default is the default selection for the compensation to use. Okay, so in this case, FCS Express is going to read any matrix that's been exported from your data, exported with your data from acquisition automatically. Okay, what it'll also do is it'll apply any matrix that you created manually in FCS Express and you specifically assigned that matrix to a file. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, but chances are this preference should suit probably about 80 to 90% of our needs for the basic user out there where they're collecting their data on an instrument, they're importing their data, and they probably need to make a tweak or two on the back end. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. Some of the other features here allow us to designate a compensation default, which I'll talk about later, and to use that as my compensation for my compensation as I load files into my layout. Okay, it's important to know that we're talking here on a layout to layout basis. So every data file that you load into a layout, these are global preferences, and these preferences are going to apply to whatever data files you load into your layout. Okay, and the compensation default is a matrix that you would specifically designate as default. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So that way, if you do have a default compensation matrix within a layout that you've saved, and you load your data into that layout, and you have this preference selected, FCS Express will automatically apply that default compensation to your data. Okay, and then there are other various options where we're looking at the FCS file, and if it turns out there is no spillover matrix saved with the FCS file, then we'll apply the compensation default, or vice versa, or we can simply just not have FCS Express apply compensation at all, and then we can just do it on our own as we need to. Okay. One of the other preferences I want to talk about is, just briefly though, is how the FCS Express is remembering the parameters within a file or within your layout. And there are two ways that we do this. So we can either remember the parameters that are being analyzed within the layout by the parameter number, parameter 1, parameter 2, parameter 3 to whatever the last parameter is, or specifically by the name. Okay? Now the number should suit the majority of us. However, we often get questions from our customers where they're trying to match up specific stains that go in a particular parameter, and they want that matrix to cover everything that's covered in that parameter, or some options similar to that. So what we can do is we have this option that we introduced a couple of versions ago in FCS Express, where we can have FCS Express remember the data by whatever parameter name is in being displayed within your plots. Okay, and specifically, whatever the axis label within the plots is, if it turned out it would actually match up with whatever matrix you created, FCS Express would automatically apply that matrix to your data. Okay, and just to further go on that, in FCS Express 7, what we've done is we've actually determined how it is you want to match that name. So underneath the data loading FCS file options, you'll now see that not only is there a keyword to use as a parameter name for the display for your X and Y axes in your plots, there's actually now a keyword for parameter matching. Okay, and you can either use that as the same as a display name, or you could do any combination of the parameter stain keyword, the parameter name keyword, however you want to match that up. Okay, for today's webinar, I'm just going to focus on stain and name, and I'm also just going to focus on using the parameter number for how we apply this matrix to our data. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to enter them in the question section of the GoToWebinar panel, and we'll try to answer them as we go, or we'll just save them for the end of the webinar. Okay. So what I've done here is probably a situation that we probably, as flow cytometry users and analysts, need to do probably 95% of the time, where we load data into plots and maybe we need to make a tweak or two. Okay. So in FCS Express, it's really easy to do that. So if I have a plot like this here, as you see on my screen, if I need to tweak the compensation within that plot, I can simply just right-click on that plot. You'll see that there's a compensation option in that that right-click menu, where I can actually access whatever compensation has been applied to that data. I can select that. And then what I can do is I can actually tweak that compensation by moving these sliders back and forth, okay? And the direction my data is going to go is dependent on these arrows that you see. So if I move each of these slider bars to the right, the data is going to go in the direction that you see here with the arrow, okay? And you can see this is all live. It all happens in real time, okay? And after you make your tweaks, if you wanted to simply just keep those settings, you can just click OK, or you could just click Restore, and FCS Express will bring you back to whatever the default was. Okay. Also, we can manually tweak our compensation settings from the compensations window. Okay, so you can access the compensations window from the Tools tab. And within the compensations window, there are two folders. One is going to store the matrices that were automatically loaded with your data. So in other words, you acquired your data on the instrument, you comped on the instrument, and you exported that data with the matrix. Okay. If it turns out that data has a matrix and you have the proper preferences in FCS Express to read that, then FCS Express automatically loads that matrix, and you can view that matrix here. Okay. So you can actually click in these cells to tweak your data as well, and this all happens live. But you can also see that if I simply tweaked it here, you can actually see these numbers change within the matrices. Okay, and you also notice that these matrices have a heat map effect to them, where we can actually see coloring based off of any of the high values or any of the low values and any shading in between. Okay, so really easy, really simple. If you need to simply just make a tweak for a particular plot, you could do that rather easily and quickly, immediately. Okay. So now the question is, what if I need to create my own matrix? Okay. Well, here is some data, some uncomped data that I've loaded into some plots. And in FCS Express, there's two ways of how we can create our own manual matrix. Okay. We can do that either by directly right-clicking on a plot. And again, going back down to that compensation option that we saw in that right-click window. And we can create new. In this window, we can give our matrix a name. We can designate whether or not we want this to be a default compensation. So if I'm doing a simple two-color analysis for FTSE and PE, and I had 300 samples that I need to analyze with the same matrix, I can simply designate this as my default and then load up my data list with whatever data files I need to analyze after this. And the same matrix will get applied to all that data as I'm analyzing. Okay. But after I do that, I can click OK. And then I can simply just adjust the sliders however I need. Okay, you can simply eyeball it, or you can actually just type in numbers here. And either way, if you click OK, you can see now that in my compensations window, I now have a plus sign that can be expanded to show me that matrix that I just created. Okay, and it's important to remember that when we create a matrix this way, it's simply just going to be for the two colors that were present within that plot. Okay, so if I actually just click on that, I can actually see that this is simply just a two-color matrix. Okay, and as I mentioned earlier, because I've actually, when I created a new matrix for that plot, and because I selected this option to make this default, you can actually see that this matrix now is listed as the default. Okay? And if I wanted to apply this to other data files, I can simply just load some new data files into my data list and then start analyzing and batching my data. Or I can actually just take this, drag it onto a plot, and that compensation will be automatically applied to that data within that plot. Or I can just tweak my values within these cells within the matrix. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply delete all this. And we're going to create a manual matrix using compensation controls that we would have collected during acquisition. Okay. So again, in the compensations window, we have these two folders. Okay. Within the compensations window, you also see that there's a toolbar up here. And the toolbar will allow us to add a new matrix that we want to create manually. Okay. So to create a new manual matrix for how many ever colors you want to create this matrix for, you can just click on that plus sign. Give your matrix a name. And then down below, you'll see that we can now perform our automatic compensation setup. Okay, and our automatic compensation setup is a number of steps that we're going to walk through. Okay, and the first step is simply just loading our controls. Okay, so the way we're going to load our controls is just by clicking on this folder icon to add data for the AutoComp. Okay. And also, as we're going to go through these steps, I'm going to show you some of the new features and enhancements we've added to FCS Express, specifically the compensation component. Okay. So I'm going to click on my folder to add some data. I'll select my controls. And right off the bat, you'll see that FCS Express automatically will match up the parameters and what negative is being used as a control for those positive stain controls. Okay. Whereas in previous versions of FCS Express, you actually had to match this up manually and determine whether or not you had a negative coming from individual tube or if you were using a universal control. Here, it's all automatic. Also, we've simplified it where if it turns out your controls had an unstained tube, we'll automatically use that unstained tube as part of, for that negative control. Okay, as you can see in this image down below. For today, I'm just using these particular cells and just going to comp directly from these cells. Okay. So proceeding to step 2. Step 2 is actually a new enhancement that we've added for version 7. And what this is, it allows us to determine what the X and Y parameters are for the scatter gate. Now, not too long ago, it used to be where the first 2 parameters in a data file were pretty much always forward scatter and side scatter. However, there became a huge push and interest in doing double discrimination and adding more area with height and width parameters to your data, and that kind of skewed things a little bit. So we need to play catch up to get to that part. And this option now accommodates that, where a user can come in and determine what parameters they want to use specifically to gate their scatter parameter for their compensation controls. Okay. Once that's been determined, we can go to step 3, where we can build our histograms. In step 3 is also where we're going to see any error messages if it turns out the data that we're using for our compensation control doesn't match up. Let's say there's a parameter mismatch where one of the files has 3 parameters, another one has 7 parameters, or the parameter names don't match up. Okay. If it turns out that you're ever in that scenario, you should be able to catch that right here, and it should specifically say what the particular issue is with whatever the issue is going on there. Okay. Otherwise, you can continue just by clicking on Build Histograms. And just like we did in previous versions, the Build Histograms will build histograms for each of the parameters for which we're comping. Okay. But again, there are some new enhancements that we've added as part of this process. Okay. So we still have a scatter plot, but you'll see now that in addition to all the different pages that we have here for our positive controls, we've actually included a scatter plot on each of those pages just to make it easier if we need to tweak a gate. Okay. So we could still do the same thing that we need to, where if I need to adjust a gate, I could do that. Or if I want to replace a gate, I can do that as well. To automatically update my data. And the scatter gate allows me to view and review that as I go from control to control. What we've also done is enhanced our peak finding capability. In previous versions, our peak finding tended to be super sensitive, where the markers tend to latch on even the slightest peak. Where here, we're actually a lot able to diagnose a peak for the entirety of our negative population or our positive population without too much tweaking. Okay, so you can see that looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. That looks pretty good. So on and so on. Okay. So if you're happy with how your controls look and how everything's gated, then what we can do is we can move on to step 4, which is an optional step, or step 5, which is also an optional step. So step 4 allows us to determine what's being used as a negative control. So because we've told the software in step 1 to use each of its own tube as a negative, we're automatically doing that as well. However, if it turns out that we actually want to use another file or another gate as the negative control for a particular population or a particular stain, then what we can do is we can actually just take that marker and drag it to a particular parameter. And then you'll see that will automatically update to reflect that. I'm going to undo that. And then step 5 allows us to add an additional spillover target if it turns out that we have an additional parameter for which we need to comp where we might not necessarily have the control, and we can simply just select the parameter. In step 6, we'll calculate the matrices for us based off either the mean or the median, and median is the selection by default. Okay. If I click on calculate matrices, FCS Express will automatically give me my spillover matrix and the inverse of that and my compensation matrix. And as I mentioned before, the compensation matrix will have a heat map effect to it just to show me what all the different values are, where any of the different values, the high values or the low values, and any of the values in between are going to be colored just so I can get an overall sense of what the range is for the values within my matrix. Okay. So now that we have this matrix, how do I get to use it? Right? So I can use it here, but how do I actually get it out of this layout and onto my actual data? Well, what I can do is I can actually export it, or I can simply just apply it. Okay. So for example, I have this data here on the first page that we're working on. Okay. If I actually wanted to take a matrix and apply it to my data, this newly created matrix that I've created, I can simply just drag and drop this. Okay. And you'll see my data snap to whatever the comp values are for that matrix. Okay. What we can also do is we can either right-click on this matrix. I can tell the software to either apply it to a selected plot or to all plots. But also you'll notice up in the compensations toolbar, there are these two new buttons that'll essentially do the same thing, that allow us to either apply this to a selected plot or to apply to all plots within my layout. Okay, so I've applied it to that one simply by dragging and dropping. If I want to apply it to this one, I can simply just select this, either choose the option to apply to a selected plot, or I could just click on this tool right here. Okay. Now what I can also do with this matrix is I can assign it to a particular file. And if I do that, then I can simply just navigate to the file that I want to use. And I can open it and apply it to that particular data file. So that way, the next time if I import that data file into FCS Express, it would automatically apply that matrix that I have assigned to it. And here's the default that I was talking about earlier. So what I can do is I can actually create a layout as a template. I can create a matrix in FCS Express and save it as the default. And I can save this overall as a template, so that way, whenever I import data, this matrix will automatically get applied to my data. Okay, and all that would be dependent on whether or not I've actually selected the preference for FCS Express to use the compensation default. Okay, so if your default compensation to use is the selection compensation default and your layout has a default assigned for a matrix, FCS Express will automatically apply that as soon as you load that data into your plots. Okay. And then finally, what you can also do is you can import and export this matrix. Okay. So I can export this. I'm going to put this on my desktop. And if I had a new layout into which I wanted to import that matrix, I could simply just open up that layout, open up that compensations window, and then I can simply just choose the option to import a compensation from file by clicking on that folder icon in the compensations window toolbar. And whatever your matrix was at the time of exporting, you'll be able to import that. You can load your data in and then apply that using the methods that we've already discussed. Okay. Again, if there are any questions, please feel free to enter them in the questions section. We go to Webinar Control Panel, and we'd be happy to answer them as we go along. Okay. So we often get questions about how to perform mixed media compensation. In other words, compensation where part of your controls are cells, part of your controls are beads, or whatever. Okay. In FCS Express, we don't really treat it any differently. The idea is that you'd simply just load your data into a matrix, just like we've talked about before. So we'd create a matrix just by clicking on the plus button here. We'd go through the compensation setup, add our controls. Again, the software automatically matches the parameters for us and what the negative is going to be. We'll select the scatter parameters. We can come in and build the histograms, which I've already done. And in this particular case, 5 of the controls that I'm using are beads, and 1 of them is using cells. Okay, so specifically, my B500 control is a cellular control. Okay, so what we can do is if I want to create a comp matrix based off of this mixed media, all I need to do is just simply use my data-specific gate feature to accommodate for that cellular control. Okay, and to make a gate data-specific, I can simply just click on that gate, and from the gating tab, I can click on the tool to make that data-specific. Okay, and what data-specific gate means, it means this is the same scatter gate that I'm using through all of my tubes. However, the coordinates for this particular gate are going to be specific for this individual file. Okay, so that way when any stats are being calculated for my data, FCS Express will automatically know to calculate the stats based off of that data-specific gate for some of the files or any of the other files that have a data-specific gate applied to them. Okay. So one of the features that we've added in FCS Express 7 is that we now have a new keyboard shortcut to enable data-specific gates. Okay. And the way that keyboard shortcut works is just simply by holding my Shift key, I can just take this gate and drag it. And when I click and drag, you'll see that the software automatically makes that data specific for me. Okay. And just to further demonstrate what this data specific gate does, again, this is the same scatter gate that I'm using for all my tubes, but if I actually go back to my B controls, you'll see that my scatter gate has a different coordinates for all of my B controls. It has a specific set of coordinates for my cellular control. And FCS Express will still calculate the proper data based off of that information. Okay. And again, if I need to move these gates around, if I want to adjust these for whatever reason, you can see that the peak findings still did a pretty good job of determining what the unstained and what the stained were for that data. I can still adjust it if I need to, if I wanted to move it around or simply widen it or close the markers. And again, just like before, if I'm happy with what I see, I can simply just come in, calculate my matrix. And I still have all the options available where if I want to assign this to a particular data set or assign this as a default, or simply just import and export or apply to particular plots, again, I could do that using the same techniques that we've seen earlier. So the question is, if we have multiple panels, do we need new layout to make each comp matrix? So the question really depends on the data. If your parameters are pretty much the same, you could probably get away with using the same matrix, but I would actually use a control where you would pretty much use up the range of your data that you see within these plots, okay? Because this is a mathematical calculation. As long as your data is within a linear range for that parameter, and you're using the same parameter across all these different panels, you should be able to get away with the same matrix. However, if you're using FTSE in one experiment or Alexa 488 in another experiment, that would warrant a separate matrix for each one of those panels, okay? I hope that answers your question. If not, please feel free to contact us at support@novosoftware.com and we can set up a separate session with you on the side to look further into whatever other questions you have or specifically at your data set in which you're interested in analyzing. Okay. All right. And finally, I want to talk about one of the new features that we've added for FCS Express 7. And this was a feature that we've gotten a lot of requests for over the years. And it was specifically the ability to add an n-by-n matrix of plots. Okay. So those of you that aren't familiar, n-by-n refers to the number of parameters within a data set, and you're creating a number of plots to accommodate viewing all those parameters in some permutation within each other. Okay. And the way we could enable n-by-n plots is simply just by selecting a plot. And you'll see now that there's this new tab up here in the ribbon that allows me to create n-by-n plots for that particular plot. Okay. So specifically, the feature that I wanted to show you is this n-by-n plots compensated feature. So what that does, it's going to create this whole array of plots for you. So that way you can visualize all your data at once. Okay, and you can see whether or not compensation was applied well or not. And what we do is we actually grab the same heat map color shading that we've seen in the matrix earlier and apply that to the background of these plots. Okay, so I can actually come in, I can tweak some data either directly in the matrix, or if I actually just right click on one of these plots and I simply just want to adjust the matrix for that plot, I can adjust that, and any change in my color, you're automatically going to see that within the plots, and it will match up with whatever the matrix values are as well. Okay, so again, this is a great tool to help you QC your data visually and to provide you more peace of mind for whatever workflow you've established for your data analysis. Okay. Also, please note that the number of plots that are created here as part of the n-by-n process is actually determined by user preference. Okay. And that preference can be found from your preferences underneath the performance section. And specifically, there is a multi-plot section where we determine the number of parameters and the number of parameters for n-by-n plots. Okay, and that pretty much wraps up compensation in FCS Express. This is a high-level overview, so definitely if anyone has any questions, please feel free to email us at support@denovosoftware.com, and we'd be happy to go over any questions or issues you may have with compensation in FCS Express. But hopefully you'll be able to see that from these features that we have enabled in FCS Express for compensation, the whole idea is that we've tried to build these features to make analysis more flexible and versatile for you for whatever workflow you have with your data. And we've also added a number of these features to make it faster and easier to create this matrix specific to your data. Okay, so again, a lot of these features that we've added to enhance the workflow, like the scatter gates or just having FCS Express automatically match up the parameters and the negatives, that's all based back on user feedback that we've gotten from customers over the years. And we're happy to finally be able to implement this so that way all of our customers can now experience this and have an enjoyable experience in FCS Express. Also, for a number of our customers that do perform mixed media compensation, the data-specific gate and the shortcut now actually makes it quite easy to do that without changing your workflow up too much compared to how you would normally create a matrix. And these new n-by-n compensated plots do provide a quick way to visualize your data and see whether or not you need to tweak your data in any way, shape, or form somewhere within your analysis. Okay. So again, if there are any questions, please feel free to email us at support@denovosoftware.com, or if you haven't already, please feel free to download a 30-day trial from our website at denovosoftware.com/demo-overview. And we'll be happy to help you out with whatever questions you have with regards to the use of that demo. Okay, and that's pretty much the end of the webinar. At this point, we will stay online for a couple more minutes just to take any questions that anyone may have. But otherwise, if anyone needs to head out, thank you for joining us. And please know that, again, if you need to contact us or have any questions, please feel free to email us at support@novosoftware.com.